I hope you know Fatou Kande. She was here already yesterday, and I asked her to come back. She comes from all the way from Chess, just some distance, and she was very willing to come and contribute to this conversation around the work of Victoria. How do you pronounce your family name? Rovine or Rovine?
Rovine.
Rovine, who is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. This is a repeat because I just wrapped up an international conference on Sufi music, and that was with a group of professors from the same university, and with the participation of 17 other professors from Turkey to discuss Sufi music. So Victoria will be discussing with you fashion design and as it relates to colonial history. Her full title is Africa, Fashion Design and Colonial History, the surprising power of clothing. That's a very apt title, the surprising power of clothing. In some part of the world, you dress whichever way you want. Maybe dressy, maybe trendy, maybe flippant, you don't care. Look at that lady right there.
Good example.
You could write a river on her outfit. Look at even Fatou Kande, who is supposed to be one of those revolutionary, activist clothes, I don't care, but if we look carefully, there is some style in the way she dresses. Yeah?
Very true.
Good. So, look, my role is over. I was supposed to be here to welcome you and to welcome our friend Victoria and tell her she should feel at home and don't feel shy, and she should be addressing this microphone very boldly because it's open for her. The rest will be between her, you, and Fatou Kande Senghor. Allow me to recognize the presence of an old-time friend to the West Africa Research Center. He's always here when we need him. He's always here when we do not even see him. That's really a distinguished professor from University Sheikh Anta Diop, who is retired, but who is still interested in seeking knowledge and dispensing knowledge. I'm talking about no less than Professor Boubacar Bari, one of the pillars of the Department of History here, and one of the pillars of the writing of African history with his seminal books on West African history, and his several distinctions, particularly from U.S. universities. So without further ado, maybe Fatou, I give you the floor, and I am going to eclipse myself. Right?
You're so trying.
Voilà, merci. Tu dis là carrément, il y a la chérie. Laissez pas tout.
Oh, okay.
Oui, c'est ça.
Donc bonjour tout le monde. Which language are we using today?
English.
English? Okay, let's use English then. So everybody gets in the room. Let's use Pidgin from Lagos if you don't mind. How should we do this? Should we listen to your presentation? And then it becomes more interesting if everybody can just jump in with their own questions and make it really alive. So we can squeeze a bit more knowledge from you again. uh, because the theme is at the same time very relaxing, at the same time very serious. Let's feel at ease and just do this the way we like having discussions, so everybody can understand and jump in freely. So nobody has to be shy, and everybody can contribute in any way they want. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming. I will just mention a little bit about my past research, just so you know how I come to this topic. I'm trying to speak just a tiny bit slowly because I know there's people here who are moving along in their English program but may not be quite perfect. And then there are others here for whom English is their first language. So as Professor Sem pointed out, I'm a professor of art history. I did my PhD thesis on Bogolan, or Bogolan Fini, in Mali, and I wrote my first book on Bogolan in contemporary Mali. So I'm very interested in what tradition means to people in their daily lives. Whereas academics, we tend to study tradition as if it were some separate category from ordinary life. And I like to look at what tradition means in people's daily lives. This type of cloth, Bogolan, is steeped in tradition, steeped in religious meaning and significance, but it's always changing. It never remains the same. So my first book was about that cloth. My second book, which came out last year, was about African fashion designers, so fashion designers from all different parts of Africa, from about the 1980s to the present, and how they make use of forms that are associated with tradition in Ghana, in Mali, in Senegal, in South Africa, in different parts of the continent. One chapter in my book was about how the French used Africa in their fashions, how they created an image of Africa that wasn't based on Africa at all. It was an invention. That topic led me to the research I'm doing now. That's why I'm here in Dakar to do research in the Archives Nationales on the 1920s and 30s and the interaction between France and mostly the French Sudan, Mali, but also I'm interested in Senegal, and how they used cotton and textiles as a form of representation of the colonies. So that's my current project. So that's what I'm presenting today. So again, thank you for coming. I want to just mention, in fact, Madame Senghor just said something that refers to what I'm about, a point I want to make. Fashion is something that, as you said, I think you said it's kind of light and fun, but it's also serious. We tend to think that it's more frivolous, not serious, but really what we wear is very much an expression of our culture and our history and ideas that we have about ourselves and others. So I think fashion is very much worth studying, even though some of my colleagues in art history might say, why don't you study painting? Why don't you study sculpture, serious art? Why do you study fashion? But I argue fashion is actually much more serious. So let me begin. This paper is set in the years around World War I. So the 19-teens, and I also extended into the 20s. So I will read, try to read slowly. Please wave if I read too fast. I'm looking at you guys here. Wave at me, okay? All right. Relations between France and its West African colonies in the years leading to and during World War I, a period of great political as well as artistic ferment, are reflected in dress innovations on both sides of the colonial system. The World War will emerge only occasionally in my paper, but what I'm focused on is that period and the fashion-related interactions between France and the French colonies in West Africa. And as I will describe, the conflict, the World War, produced movements of people and images that shaped dress practices at the intersection of Africa and Europe. This was also the height of France's colonial pursuit in Africa. And not coincidentally, this period saw the flourishing of European misrepresentation, indeed the wholesale invention of African cultures in Europe. Clothing was a particularly important medium for this projection of the so-called primitive. So clothing was important in France especially, the representation of Africa as a primitive place. Through this analysis of dress, I will also describe how two cities figured in the discourse surrounding fashion in France and its colonies. One of these cities is Paris, which was then and is still now a global hub of fashion design and a key creative and economic center. The name of the other city, Timbuktu, was and is well known in Europe and all over the world, though the city itself is not. This name evokes a vague sense of the distant, the exotic, and the timeless in the Western imagination, ostensibly a world away from the speed and contemporary nature of fashion design. And yet, as my research in Timbuktu and neighboring regions in Mali demonstrates, this city is not remote from fashion. Indeed, it has its own fashion culture. Fashion has a special significance at the intersection of Western and non-Western cultures, particularly in historical settings. What I'm showing you here is one of many images I could pick to show how in France the idea of the primitive in fashion was a source of amusement and joking. Okay? So this cartoon is mocking women for dressing in a way that borrows from Africa and other non-Western parts of the world. Because the term fashion is tightly bound to modern Western culture, it's particularly difficult to define in a global context. Indeed, this category of dress has been used as a shorthand tool for cultural classification in the interactions between African and Western societies. It's a way of measuring the attainment of, I put my quotes again, civilized or Western status. Two important people who've written about this described how Western observers have long evaluated dress practices as fashion or non-fashion. And that this idea mirrored the familiar and dangerous dichotomy of large versus small scale society, literate versus non-literate, developed versus undeveloped, people with history and those without history. So the idea of saying people do have fashion and they don't have fashion, that has serious implications. Before turning to France and French West Africa, I want to begin with a dramatic convergence of fashion, Africa, and Europe, a story whose final act was played out as an element of the First World War. King Ibrahim Njoya was the ruler of the Bamum Kingdom in Cameroon between 1889 and 1933. Njoya was an exceptionally creative dress innovator. He wasn't officially a fashion designer, but he was very creative with dress. His work is unusually well documented by a big group of photographs of the king and his court. The photographic record begins in 1902 with photographs by German missionaries, colonial agents, and merchants who visited the kingdom. Cameroon was a German colony from 1884 to 1916. Beginning in 1913, Njoya began to take pictures of himself, self-portraits. In several photographs, Njoya wears a variety of sharply tailored German-style military dress uniforms, indicating his fluency in the status symbols of the German officials who were newly established in his reign. Significantly, these garments were not copies, but rather creative adaptations that reflected Bamum aesthetic systems. The braided cord on epaulets that were worn by French, British, German soldiers were transformed into bands of beads, because beads were an important symbol of status in Bamum. Medals and ribbons on European uniforms were transformed into beaded emblems. Njoya had artisans in his court create elaborate garments based on direct experience with or simply images of German dress uniforms. So this man in the center of the photograph was one of the embroiderers who worked in the palace doing nothing but German-style uniforms, but in Bamum status symbols. Okay? These were creative amalgamations of indigenous garment styles along with European-style tailoring and ornamentation. In a completely different style and emerging out of a different cultural exchange, Njoya also posed wearing a voluminous, untailored robe adorned with embroidered motifs, along with drawstring pants and an elaborately, wrapped turban. This style was also imported, another illustration of Njoya's strategic use of dress innovation to reinforce political alliances. The court's adaptation of this style of garment, which is much more familiar to all of you, I'm sure, was the result of Njoya's successful bid for military assistance from a Fulani, or Po, leader to suppress a rebellion in his domain. In gratitude for this aid, Njoya converted to Islam, and his whole court converted to Islam, and adopted elements of Fulani culture, including dress like this. So the robes, and you're seeing here, this is 1984, it's more recent, but I could have brought you a photograph from 2017 of the Sultan in Bamum, and he would have been wearing robes like this. So my point is that these robes are now an element of what we call traditional attire. I put the quotes around it to say tradition is always changing, right? This style, which we now take as traditional, may have come into vogue in Bamum just a few years before the German military uniform. Now, the German military style uniform never made its way into the wardrobe of the kingdom, but the Fulani, or Pul style dress, did. Njoya and his court ceased to wear European-style dress as a result of shifting German power dynamics, or I should say European power dynamics. In 1908, with the death of Njoya's closest German colleague, a Captain Hans Glauning, a new administrator quickly moved to prohibit Njoya's guards first from using rifles and then from wearing German-style uniforms. By 1909, German officials were pleased to note that Njoya and his men had ceased to wear what they called fantasy uniforms. Clearly, for some in the German administration, the uniforms were as threatening as the guns, an illustration of the power of clothing innovation. Okay? So we know that German officials felt threatened by Njoya's use of these uniforms. Cameroon was a front in the First World War. From 1914 to 16, British, French, and Belgian forces fought to take this colony from German control. When first the British and then the French were given territory that contained Bamum in the aftermath of Germany's defeat, Njoya was no longer viewed as a favored African ruler, and he was deposed, sent into exile. The shifting winds of colonial power find an artistic analogy in the fast-changing trends that characterized fashion in Beaumont. Fashion may appear to provide a flimsy structure on which to hang an analysis of the interactions between Europe and West Africa. Fashion does not strive for evidence or truth. Clothing innovators are not expected to base their work on scholarly research or philosophical conviction, but instead on creative inspiration. Rather than digging deep, fashion is explicitly concerned with surfaces. Surfaces, as cultural commentator Edward Said described in his literary analysis of the Western construction of the Orient, or Orientalism, surfaces are precisely where profound cultural insights often reside. Fashion's exteriority, like the surface of Said's text, does not indicate a lack of content. Its audiences might expect designers to provide beauty, theatricality, poetry, cultural commentary, and political insights. I offer here an exploration of two types of African fashion in the context of colonial rule in the reverberations of the First World War, emanating from opposite sides in the colonial system: French fashion design about Africa and fashion design by Africans. In the case of Paris fashions, designers make Africa speak to Western audiences. Factual Africa is not its concern, but an exploration of dress innovations in Timbuktu, a city located in former French Sudan, from the early to the mid-20th century, reveal a different form of fashion beyond the orbit of French influence entirely. Beginning with, I don't need to tell any of you this history, I suspect, but when I give talks to others who aren't familiar with West African history, I always want to point out that beginning with the conquest of Algeria, initiated in the mid-19th century, France built an extensive empire in Africa that reached its peak in the interwar years. The early 20th century marks a period of great intensity in European colonial history, when France and Britain competed to control and expand their overseas possessions in Africa and elsewhere, raising the profile of these regions in their national consciousness. I'll just point out the recruiting poster from 1930 is all about clothing as a way of constructing ideas about cultures. I think, I won't go into it, but one could definitely read this poster in terms of how it uses clothing and the lack of clothing and the composition of the poster itself to imply a lot about power, of course. Periodic expositions, public celebrations of national achievements, including colonial pursuits, also brought the colonies into the streets of Paris and other French cities. Some of you may be familiar with the very famous exposition in 1931. This is a poster for it, and this is a photograph of the so-called inhabitants of the French West Africa section, which was built, the section was built to resemble the famous mosque of Djenné, and people were brought, I'm sure you all are familiar with this, people were brought from Senegal, especially artisans, jewelers, weavers, and others, to populate the colonial expositions. The advent of World War I increased the presence of the colonies in French lives as these faraway possessions became sources of soldiers who fought and too often died in the service of the metropolitan state. And again, it's Senegal's history that we're referring to here with the famous tirailleurs sénégalais. African soldiers were a visible presence beyond the battlefields and garrisons, on furloughs and in parades, in newspapers and advertisements. This is a cartoon that has on the far right there, a West African soldier in a Parisian cafe. The image of the black French subjects, and more rarely citizens, became an element of France's visual culture. Their impact emblematized by the famous Banania advertisements that debuted in 1915. How many of you are already familiar? I'm just curious, seen the Banania advertisements? They're very fascinating. Sorry. Yeah, they're very, very interesting. And they almost continue up until the 1980s or thereabouts. So using the famous tirailleur sénégalais as the emblem of the colonies and the exotic, and how useful the colonies are to us was the idea. So I recommend looking that up because it's very interesting. Beginning in 1915 or so, and then continuing surprisingly late in France. This was a breakfast cereal. This was also a key moment for the development of the French fashion industry, whose origins are often traced to Charles Frederick Worth's mid-19th century establishment of dressmaking shops in Paris. By the turn of the 20th century, other designers were following Worth's model, including one of the House of Worth's former employees, Paul Poiret, who figures prominently in the fashion relationship between Africa and France. By 1910, Poiret's brand was distinguished by his generalized references to the exotic, drawing from popular conceptions or misconceptions of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. His work circulated widely in early 20th century France and beyond. His work was sold in the United States and all over Europe. I will return to Poiret shortly. French colonial rule in Africa and French fashion design converged in the adaptation, and more frequently the invention, of African styles by Parisian designers. A 1914 illustrated commentary on the French fashion scene entitled Le Vrai et le Faux Chic exemplifies this significance of fashion as a powerful symbol. And it brings together our two key cities, Timbuktu and Paris. The story related in the folio, which was sold in a limited edition and made more widely available through coverage in fashion magazines, the story depended on its audience's assumption that Africa was at the opposite end of the fashion spectrum from France. Written and illustrated by the prominent cartoonist known as Sem, Le Vrai et le Faux Chic lampooned what Sem considered to be the frivolous and dangerously exotic fashions that were coming into vogue at the time. He presented a parable introducing an unnamed Frenchman, I quote from him, a Parisian man of good breeding with delicate and sound taste. This man went to Africa for 10 years where he was, quote, completely isolated from the civilized world, completely ignorant of the evolution of modern life. Africa's supposed remoteness is key to Sem's narrative. He needed a location his readers would have understood to be entirely beyond the reach of fashion. Returning to his home 10 years later, Sem's French traveler found that the elegant Parisian women he remembered were transformed. Their slavish dedication to fashion trends led them to absurdities like those you see here that seemed to emerge directly from so-called primitive cultures. Sem's prancing caricatures illustrate his vivid and highly racialized depictions of fashion's folly. In his words, these were savage women adorned with gris-gris, Kanaks wearing colorful mops, troglodytes covered in dangling animal skins, and a fuzzy-haired cannibal wearing a bone through her nose. So it's easy to see how very to say the least, troubling this idea is from our vantage point today. At this last nightmarish vision, the well-bred Frenchman, quote, shuts his suitcases and takes the first camel bound for Timbuktu. The choice of Timbuktu as the destination for this distressed traveler reflects a phenomenon that numerous scholars have noted. Timbuktu's association with mystery and inaccessibility makes it a paradigm for the inaccessible. In her discussion of le vrai et le faux chic, Nancy Troy uses the folio to illustrate the shifting mood of the Parisian fashion world as it was manifested in the tension between two tendencies, each epitomized by a well-known designer. Poiret, who's on the right, whose exoticism was ascendant, and Jean Paquin, whose innovations were inspired by the European past. Sem blamed African and other non-Western influences for what he referred to as moral and material perversion of French fashion. His critique provides a vivid example of the construction of Africa as the embodiment of fashion's opposite. Sem treated the presence of African and other non-Western influences on clothing styles in France as patently absurd, an inversion so disturbing that it sends an urbane Parisian packing for the remote sands of Timbuktu. While much of Poiret's work makes reference to real or imagined Asian and Middle Eastern precedents, Africa is a consistent presence in his work as well. His interest in the Far East and Africa placed Poiret firmly within the styles of his day. As one fashion historian noted, although few fashion designers were as deeply committed to exoticism as Poiret, most of them at least dabbled in Orientalism. And these are two fashion plates from a fashion magazine showing Poiret's designs. I'll just note this dress is called Nubienne in a clear reference to Africa. And the one on the right is the sort of embodies his Asian, sort of vaguely Orientalist sort of style. Yes, exactly. An analysis of two garments that exemplify Poiret's Africanisms provides insight into the cultural context of their production. A woman's dress called Tangère, which was featured in a 1920 fashion magazine in an elegant illustration by Georges Lepape, echoes the shape and details of the selham or aknif, men's cloaks associated with Morocco's high Atlas region. In addition to the transposition of an African form, the style's name, Tangère, creates a textual link to the continent. Tanger, or Tangier in English, is the city at Morocco's northern tip, just across the Strait of Gibraltar from Spain. The name alone was evocative in Poiret's day, for Tangier was the gateway to the remote romantic realm of North Africa for European visitors. By shifting the garment's gender associations from a male cloak to a woman's dress, Poiret distinguished the garment from its African origins. This shift also reflects, this is an actual example in a museum of the dress that's illustrated in the drawing. The shift also reflects the power dynamic between colonizer and colonized. Transforming an African garment from male to female reverberates with the Orientalist perspective in early 20th century Europe, one element of which was the feminization of the other, the so-called other, in this case Africa. Around 1923, Poiret appears to have used a fabric produced in West Africa to create a dress for his wife, Denise Poiret. The garment's name returns us to a city we know as the emblem of France's vision of exotic Africa. The dress is called Timbuktu, a variation on, can you all see the spelling down there? It's not the standard French spelling, Tombouctou, nor is it the English spelling. It's a variation on both. Poiret likely chose the name not to refer specifically to the city and its history, but rather, like Sem, to create a sense of distant, almost mythical exoticism. The cotton dress, which is a simple sheath with no sleeves and a boat neck, is made complicated by Poiret's use of strip-woven cotton. The fabric, likely originally in the form of a blanket, is of a genre made in many variations in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, all part of the Soudan Français during Poiret's day. Like much West African strip weaving, the cloth is adorned with blocks of undyed light cotton, blocks of solid blue, likely indigo, and sections patterned with stripes and geometric motifs in maroon, yellow, orange, and gray. The cloth is of a type associated with the Fulani or Peul ethnic group. Although its provenance or its origins of this specific cloth is not clear to us, Poiret could have acquired the textile from one of the expositions that I mentioned earlier that featured West African weavers among its African participants. So those participants made things while they were in Paris or Marseille, wherever the event took place, which they could sell to visitors and they might take them home as souvenirs. World War I had a very direct impact on the Poiret fashion house. The designer himself served in the French armed forces from early in the war until 1919. He continued designing on his return, though his popularity had faded. Still, his impact continued. In 1924, the American fashion magazine Harper's Bazaar continued to identify non-Western and specifically African influences in French fashion. In Paris, the author declared, stylish women were, quote, turning their backs to the Mediterranean and setting their faces more firmly toward the south, plunging more or less into the throbbing heart of Africa. That's from a fashion magazine, 1924. I'm showing you here on the right a photo spread that I love. It's very disturbing, but I love it. From 1931, showing a fashionable Parisian lady on her trip to Senegal, where the caption tells us that her car is on a boat being taken across a river to a cannibal village that she is visiting. So this very exoticizing sort of construction again. And on the right is from the New York Times in the 1920s, a series of clothes that were all based on a kind of cloth from Central Africa, not West Africa, but Central. But we see the influence of Africa in all of these. This evaluation of the fashion scene at its European center reflects the importance of the expositions that celebrated France's World War I and colonial endeavors, the impact of African soldiers on Europe's war, as well as the prominence of Paul Poiret. Do you know how I'm doing for time? All right. Timbuktu effectively evokes the so-called throbbing heart of Africa in the Western imagination. The name served as a shorthand, as we've seen, for Sem and Poiret to suggest all that is not Western. The city's international profile emphasizes its mystery and inaccessibility, as we see in this late 19th century book, Tombouctou la Mystérieuse, and then much more recently, Timbuktu still calls itself the mysterious city. In fact, the city's reputation in the West far exceeded its actual influence. It was an important center for Islamic learning and regional trade during its heyday in the 14th to 16th centuries, when its association with the trade in gold from further south made it legendary in the West. When Western explorers first reached the city in the 19th century, they were largely disappointed by its sleepy streets. But what of Timbuktu's fashion culture? Was Sem's sophisticated Parisian correct in assuming that the city would provide a haven from the instability of changing dress styles? Timbuktu has a long history as a cosmopolitan center with its own fashion culture, which was likely unrecognizable to French and other non-local observers because it didn't intersect with Western styles. Here I extrapolate from limited documentation of dress practices in Timbuktu in the early 20th century, and from my research on dress in the city from the mid-20th century to the present. During research trips to Timbuktu in 2007 through 2009, I observed and interviewed embroiderers like Baba Jite, who I'll introduce you to in a moment, and the members of his workshop. Western observers of daily life in this part of Mali have long noted the distinctive dress of the city, a style of bubu called a tilbi. In 1900, Hakkard's monograph on Timbuktu identified the tilbi as the primary attire of both men and women of means, noting that the amount of silk embroidery on the garment directly reflected the wealth of its owner, a measure of tilbi quality that still pertains today. And this is the embroidery workshop of Baba Jite, who's sitting on the far left, who told me that a very, very elaborate tilbi bubu can take years to embroider because of the complexity of the stitches and the amount of stitching, the amount of embroidery, which really enhances the status of the garment. Their high cost reflects the garment's elegant forms and luxurious materials, as well as their association with high status and piety. There's a close-up of a pocket. There are embroiderers who specialize in only the pockets, or only a part of the yoke, or only an element of the back. In 1932, French administrator Charles Monteuil described the embroidery that adorns tilbi in nearby Djenné as, quote, sober and simple, extremely graceful, in very good taste, very well made, and stand out beautifully from the background made of indigenous cloth, which is a bit off-white in color. The tilbi's rich embroidery consists of precise, complex motifs that are named for elements of the natural world, including mouse teeth, cat's eye, and lizard's head. The styles of stitches are each named as well. In many cases, each motif, not only it's a motif, but it's made using a separate stitch style. So it's very complex. The styles of stitches are each named as well, differentiating between stitches of various lengths, the ways in which the stitches are grouped together, or their orientation. Motifs often have other meanings as references to Islamic history, belief, and cosmology. Although they have become stylistic conventions, the designs originally served protective functions. For example, tilbi bubus incorporate schematic magic squares, as well as references to specific Quranic texts and specific figures, saints and angels and others. These deep roots in history and religion might lead one to assume that embroidery is a conservative practice, resistant to change. And here's Baba Jite showing me the back of a very old tilbi in his collection. Indeed, embroiderer Baba Jite's explanation of the motif's importance dramatically attests to the premium placed on consistency in some elements of the garment's style. And he said, if one changes the motifs, it is as if one has changed something in the Quran. Thus, it's impossible to change. But Timbuktu's embroiderers have long sought to create distinctive styles. As we examined images of tilbi from the early 20th century, Jite noted the subtle changes in style, the delineation of a motif, the use of a netting-like border around pockets. He spoke of embroidery as handwriting, with every embroiderer bringing his own hand to the repertoire of motifs. This is a tilbi robe in the collection of the Quai Branly in Paris. It's dyed blue, Baba Jite told me, because sometimes if a tilbi gets very, very old and gets stained, you dye it in order to continue using it. For this reason, leading men and women in Timbuktu and other cities in the region seek to own more than one tilbi. Despite the consistencies that make the tilbi distinctive, a politician, imam, or wealthy merchant might aim to purchase a tilbi from each of the embroiderers in the region. The development of a distinctive style has long been key to this fashion statement's story and history. In addition, early descriptions by French missionary Auguste Dupuy-Yakuba and others indicate that technological innovation was constant in the past as today. The oldest Tilbean collections, which date back to the 19-teens and 20s, like this also from the Quai Branly, show evidence of a shift in materials that required a corresponding change in technique. In brief, they changed from using strip woven cloth to industrially manufactured cloth. And today, the highest status tilbes are made of a particular brand of bazin. Is that the word you all use here? From Germany, and that's the highest status, unlike in the past where it was strip woven. Let's see, just a little bit. The most recent innovation in the tilbe form is represented by Mama Arber Maiga's work. He's based in Bamako, who has begun to create tilbe using a foot pedal sewing machine, reproducing stitches and motifs, but cutting the time required to produce a garment from years to a matter of months. His prices reflect the decreased labor intensity of the work, a combination of handwork and fast fashion that has found a ready market in Maiga's community. Like all innovations, the tilbe fashion system requires familiarity with the hallmarks of the style in order to appreciate the inventiveness of the embroiderers. So to conclude, in addition to bringing African soldiers to European streets and battlefields, the First World War and the colonial system also transformed and intensified Africa's image in European popular imagination. Dress innovations, the hallmarks of fashion, both in France and in West Africa, provide a context in which to explore two cities that are illuminated by their fashion cultures. Neither Paris nor Timbuktu offered a haven from fashion in the early decades of the 20th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. I must say I was thrilled to come and sit next to you and listen to you. I come from a film background, and when I came back to Senegal 25 years ago, I started with costume designs for film, probably because the way filming in Senegal, the cinema industry was so organized, and there was not much room for young women that thought they could be first or second assistant. So I started working with Sandra Guzman that said, who made the costumes for my film, I think it was Fat Kidney. And I said, no, I'm not doing costumes. So in the end, I did that film, and then I did 10 other great African filmmakers. And I kept saying, but I'm a director, I'm a photographer. And I haven't been doing costumes for the past 6 to 7 years. And as I'm going into my fiction mode now, my script that the most elaborated is the story of a fashion designer in 1930 in Timbuktu. So it was something really very interesting because I had to read, I had to do my documentation about how to build the character. So I had to read most of your works. So it's an immense, thrilling pleasure to be here and to get a first grip. And the script has been very lucky, and I think it's even scaring a few French producers. But I believe it's going to be, if not a masterpiece, it'll contribute into bringing back the truth about a great part of our history that was lost in translation. So the floor, you know what this wonderful woman does. You may swing in your questions. I'll open a list and have your names. So, you know, I'll go back and forth, and we'll try to have an interesting debate. Okay? So who wants to go first? Who wants to do contribution and who wants to do questions?
J'ai besoin d'au moins 20 questions.
Et s'il n'y en a pas, on interroge directement. You want to make a comment? You want to make a comment? Not yet? Ok. Bon, on interroge, hein?
En français ou
En français ou en anglais. So that should open a few doors. Voilà, monsieur?
Thank you, Professor. Actually, my question is not very related to this, but because it's talking about fashion in Africa. So, and you focused on Africa and Europe. I was wondering if in your work you found any relationship between Africa and the US, like slavery, if slavery brought kind of African fashion in the US?
That's a very good question. I didn't look at that because, I mean, I could look at that in the present, but I don't think I could look at that in really so much in historical terms. A little bit, but not a whole lot. Because, of course, in this context of slavery, people were brought against their will and disempowered, so they had little opportunity to deliberately bring fashion influence. But later, we certainly can talk about African influence on style in the context of African American culture, yes. And the cloth that I wrote my dissertation about, Bogolan, are people familiar with Bogolan Fini from Mali? Not many. It's a cloth like, there are two kinds of cloth that have become symbols of Africa really all over the world, mostly maybe Europe and the United States. So if an African American person might wear this cloth as a form of showing pride in their identity as a Black American. So Africa has definitely had an influence in that sense. Even if you don't know where the cloth is from, you would still take pride as a person of African heritage to wear it. So in that sense, we can certainly see influence. Yeah.
I'll add, for example, that the Bogolan was really famous by Chris Seydoux, the 80s, and today by the reggae singer, Tiken Jah Fakoly, who shows up on stage with this big gown that is made of Bogolan. There's this, while I was doing the research, of course, I was trying to look exactly for that question, what kind of links could be done from slavery? And I found this little code that pointed out that when you were taken by force, you don't have time to prep for it, but somehow food made it on the boats, rice, and a seed that is a sort of a tint. It's called indigo. So then many years later, of course, kente became one of the symbols of the whole linked to the motherland, and but very few textiles from the sub-Saharan region of
People have speculated about it, but no proof. Looking at quilting, yes, but we can't say that.
the African American community has sometimes been fantasized about creating its own link through the existence of quilting.
Mhm.
When you look at it on the continent, you don't have much of it.
No.
No. In history, you said.
Thank you for a really wonderful presentation. So you talked at the beginning a little bit about sort of the Africanization of European military dress. Was there also sort of a Europeanization of local clothing when they would take sort of, traditional sort of local styles, adding European flavors to them?
Yes, definitely. And that often took the form of garments, that is, elements of an ensemble. So people have written wonderful work about top hats and how top hats were incorporated into dress systems in Africa in very specific ways. So the top hat worn in coastal Ghana had a different style from the top hat worn in Sierra Leone or worn in South Africa or elsewhere. So dress elements, hats are very flexible, hats move quickly, so hats were important, and the pith helmet. The pith helmet is a helmet that was an emblem of colonial power. But Africans, yes, that was the French term for it. It was supposed to protect you from the sun, but Africans adapted it to their own dress style, which is surprising because you would think that represented repression, but it actually represented power. So we have that. And we also have, especially, my best example would be in Ghana and Nigeria, women's fashions that were based on long-standing practices of wrappers and a very simple untailored shirt, but made tailored because of the influence mostly of European missionaries who told women, you should be sewing, even though men were the tailors. But they said, no, sewing is a woman's work, so they brought these styles, which then became very local, very local. Right. And that more, I see that as I travel, I think Francophone, this is generally, Francophone Africa, Francophone West Africa, has much more preserved dress styles that go back millennia than, in my view, what I see in Anglophone West Africa. And that may be because missionaries were more focused on dress and teaching people how to dress, as it were. Also South Africa, the same is true. There's a big focus on dress. Yep. Oh, you're supposed to go.
So, since you brought up this kind of Francophone, Anglophone juxtaposition, my question is very much on those lines. I'm wondering, have you ever encountered kind of a similar trend in sort of, I know that Britain is not known for its Parisian level of fashion necessarily, but did you see a similar sort of riffing on colonial styles in their colonies? And I'm wondering particularly because you talk about Said a little bit, and those ideas are sort of the trans-imperial, right? Like not specific to French Empire necessarily, so
Right.
just maybe a little, because you mentioned a couple of examples as well of Ghanaians, you know, so yeah.
Right. So you're asking about in Britain,
Yeah.
do they create Africanisms
Yeah,
in
like
their
is there a
fashion?
similar
Yeah.
phenomenon happening in Britain and its colonies as you described for France and its colonies a couple days ago too?
Well, I have to confess, I didn't look at that specifically, so it's hard to say. But I would say much less so. And I don't know why that would be, but I found it less. It may be because Poiret was such a major force internationally in fashion that he, he is the icon of this kind of movement. But I'm sure that, I know in terms of textiles, specific types of textiles, British textile designers were influenced. But they used the textiles to create clothing that was in very much the same style as it had always been.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry I came in late to the talk, so I don't feel completely qualified to ask this question. But I was wondering, when I was looking at the cartoons by Sem, is it Sem?
Yes.
What that one that you focused on reminded me most of was the sort of iconic photographs of Josephine Baker. And I'm just wondering if you could position her in terms of time period with that. And then the second thing, you might not have been able to see it from where you're sitting, but from my vantage point, just those pictures, the cartoon by Sem and the cloth that's on the table, bear a striking similarity. And I think in the markets here, this is made primarily for the tourist trade. And it's a European image of Africa that I see reflected in that cloth too.
That's a very good point.
It was really striking when you have the cartoon up there, and that was right down below.
I'm just
So-
looking at the selvage. It says Kaji guaranteed tourist print. So that answers that question right there. That's amazing. I've never seen one that actually says that. But anyway, Josephine Baker. Do people know who Josephine Baker was?
Yes, we do.
Some of you do, I don't know if everybody does. So
They all do.
she was an American from St. Louis, Missouri, who came from very poor background and became a dancer in sort of a vaudeville show that traveled. She went to Paris in 1926, I believe, and the Sem was 1919, so she post-dates that. But the two are closely related. I mean, part of the reason that Josephine Baker could become a superstar is because the ground was prepared for her, you know, to be there. And she became the icon of Africa all over Europe, but she had never been to Africa in her life until something like the 1940s. I think she went to South Africa, where she was horrified by the apartheid system and became an activist, and at the end of her life was coming to the March on Washington, you know, and in the circle of Martin Luther King Jr. So her life is very fascinating, so I'm glad you mentioned her. And I write about her in my book in terms of her banana skirt. This famous skirt she wore that was a costume made of bananas. It was very erotic and exotic. And there are questions about who invented the banana skirt and what did she have to do with this. So she was part of this projection of Africa as exotic. Yeah.
Thank you for the remark. Yes, we'll cut a piece for your research.
Thank you very much.
Oui, Shannon.
So, thank you very much for such a brilliant presentation. We really appreciate it because it has taught us a lot about Africa, fashion, design, and colonial history. I mean the power of clothing, the surprising power of clothing. So what I have noticed from this presentation, I may say that Africa has seen a great shift in terms of fashion, which participate in making it the continent of contemporary design. I say that African people were claiming for a time to move on from top of the so-called black continent on the basis of a wide variety of examples making Africa shows how design is accompanying